Ladies and gentlemen, Happy New Year to you. And I'm recording this in advance of New Year because obviously New Year is just around the corner. And so you're watching it on New Year's Day. And to that I say, Happy New Year. I really hope you have a good and successful 2026. Can you believe it's 2026 already? Yeah, I remember when it was all the year 2000 and we were all worried that the computers would crash because of the rollover to the 2000. We all thought they were going to go back to like year zero and computers everywhere would crash. We'd have no electricity. Remember that? Good times. In any case, I thought what we would do is on this day, look at all the Christmas Day addresses. Yes, I understand it's about a week or so since Christmas. In any case, the Christmas messages were rather interesting. I say interesting, they really weren't at all. But in any case, let's look at them anyway. And let's start off with the UK. Because, yeah, the UK is just retarded and I've done loads of videos on that. But before we get on to the main videos of today, can you yet again remind you, subscribe to the channel, guys. And if you want to support the work that I do, you're welcome to buy me a coffee. The link is in the description box below. So let's look at Kia Starmer's Christmas Day address. Starmer framed Christmas around economic pain. Yes, there's nothing quite like reducing everything in society down to economic measures, and people themselves is just nothing more than economic units. Kia Starmer says that the cost of living crisis remains the public's top concern, and then acknowledges that Christmas intensifies hardships because, according to Starmer, key components of Christmas are loneliness, financial stress, and anxiety. Anxiety caused by the Labour government itself, because he presents the Labour core promises to fix household finances and stabilise everyday life, and according to him, he's still going to do all of that, despite never actually managing to do it. Now, his actual address carefully avoided any form of specific policy detail. He wasn't actually sure how he was going to fix these things. Instead, it was all just emotional reassurance. It wasn't actually around delivery. He thanked frontline workers, including NHS, emergency services, armed forces, and volunteers who support the lonely. And all of this at a time the UK's growth remains weak. Starmer himself doesn't actually have an answer for it. He recognizes what the problems are. He reassures us it's all going to get better because trust me, bro. But what we can see is that it was his government's budget tax increases that are actually biting the middle class and the lower class and causing cost of life difficulties. So Labour itself is now the very ones responsible for the hardships of the public. Whilst Labour says that they acknowledge the hardships of the public and don't worry, trust me, bro, they'll fix it, but all their policies are the very things that cause the problems in the first place. Yeah, it's very contradictory because they can't just admit what we all know, and that is that they caused the problem. In any case, other UK leaders signalled fragmentation, with the Conservatives emphasising Christian values, because there is now this idea that Christianity is under great repression in the United Kingdom with the rise of Islam, and I've done numerous videos on that. Now, the Lib Dems themselves frame Christmas as a symbolic global solidarity against what? I don't know. Free Palestine, maybe? Who knows? The Greens focused on migrants and borders, because nothing says Christmas like migrants and borders, and Reform UK leaned heavily into its grassroots theatrics, with the ultimate takeaway from the entire Christmas Day address is that UK politics is shifting from policy debates to moral storytelling. No one can actually tell you how they're going to fix this stuff. They all recognize that there's problems, but they don't really know how to fix them. Now contrast this to the address given in South Africa by the Anglican Archbishop, who, in his Christmas message, was unusually blunt. He said that South Africa faces corruption, inequality, and despair, and he says that faith in democracy is collapsing. All of this to be true. Now, he argues that Christmas is not about escapism. He says that God enters history as it is, not as we wish it to be. And he connects the present moment, the suffering that we are experiencing, to colonialism, apartheid, and post-liberation corruption and elite failure. So, yeah, I was a little bit worried where this would go, but at least he recognizes that the post-liberation parties are the very problems that we now have in. Now, he further cited public sentiment that roughly 7 in 10 South Africans are dissatisfied with democracy, with their core concerns being unemployment, crime, and infrastructure collapse, and corruption from said liberation parties. And he warned of the dangerous coping mechanisms being exploited in South Africa with people trying to somehow mitigate the effects of a crumbling state, specifically the explosion of online gambling, with addiction replacing opportunity. Now, he flagged major red warning lights in South Africa, specifically the rising openness to military rule because of the lack of satisfaction in democracy, and gave an explicit warning that coups don't fix corruption, they simply entrench it. Now, he himself criticized forms of ideological drift occurring in South Africa and suggested that some people's faith is now being wrapped into Christian nationalism, and the net result of that was a demonization of the other, as he described. Now, he said that his hope is that help would not come from the elites, but rather that change would come from ordinary people choosing truth and justice. But he did expand the argument beyond South Africa. In typical fashion, many of these individuals just can't help themselves. So what he actually said is that the Christmas story is deeply political. It involves a Roman occupation, census, taxation, and displacement. So basically colonialism. He says that Jesus is born among the poor as a refugee and under empire. So obviously he's repressed. He directly paralleled this to modern refugees, migrants, and victims of gender-based violence and climate-driven poverty. So immediately we see the whole political agenda, the ideology that he frames and says we shouldn't really have forms of religion. We're already seeing it right here. And he directly linked all of the issues with elites hoarding power and wealth, which is giving rise to populism, xenophobia, and extremism. And he warned against Christian nationalism. He says that this is where we use religion as a form of identity warfare, although I would say that Christian nationalism isn't the threat in the West. I understand why a Christian preacher would want to talk about the Christian nationalism threat, but let's be honest, the actual threat in the West and in Africa and in the East is actually around Islamism, Islamic nationalism. That is where all the terrorist attacks and all of the threats to, should we say, the Western order is coming from. So the key takeaways from his address is that Christmas is not about comfort. Instead, it's a challenge to the system that perpetrates injustice. Oh, I see. So Christmas now is social justice and critical race theory? Yeah, I don't know. This is why the Anglican Church is just like full of crap and is dying fast. Now, talking of another dying religion, let's look at the Christian address from Pope Leo, who gave a very weird Christmas Day address, where he called for direct talks between Russia and Ukraine. And he condemned the war as senseless destruction. Yes, this is all true, but I don't really know what it has to do with Christmas. In any case, he warned of lasting damage. He talked of physical rubble and moral wounds, because these were the consequences of the war themselves. And obviously, he then had to go, let's turn our attention to Gaza. He says that people are living in temporary shelters. He said that they live with cold, rain, and with shortages, with many being left with nothing. And he highlights the humanitarian collapse in Gaza, obviously, with the UN warnings of hypothermia risk and the aid bottlenecks occurring. And he calls on Europe to show solidarity with those in need, all whilst implicitly criticizing any former country that has now adopted hardened immigration policies. So yet again, here we see another political address on Christmas Day. So much being said about Christ, right? It's basically Christ's birthday, and they're all talking about their own little personal pet social justice project, as if that's somehow the most important thing on that day specifically. I suppose the one thing that we can take from all of these addresses is that, yet again, lots of moral language and moralizing and lecturing by the liberal elite. And I say liberal elite because these are all liberal left-wing political causes. But yet again, we're finding that there's nothing really concrete in terms of how do you actually solve this. No one actually has a political answer. Just lots of moralizing. So everybody acknowledges the crises that everybody's suffering, and everybody says that it's everybody else's responsibility to somehow fix it. These leaders are all offering forms of empathy, symbolism, moral framing, but none of them has any form of concrete accountability or structural reform or honest reckoning with their own failed policies. Religion for these individuals is nothing more than a way to comfort, warn, and to moralize. Yeah, I really don't see these Christmas Day addresses as being worthwhile, but that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think of all of this in the comment section below, and until next time, bye.